What was it like to be in the recording studio when the Foo Fighters recorded one of their first albums, or Tool for that matter, some other great 90s bands as well? What was it like to be at the beginning of the personal computer revolution that happened in the 80s? What was it like to buy Bitcoin at $7 when it's now $60 a coin? Well, I'll tell you, today's podcast with Myles Wakeham, my guest today, is as much about life philosophy and the lessons of living your authentic life as it is business and commerce. And we talk about art, music, meeting the business and commerce side of things and how it does have to come together. But living your true, authentic purpose is what he talks about. And at the very end, he makes the analogy of a surfer and how he's lived his life as a surfer. And when you hear the end, it'll make a lot more sense, but it really resonated with me. And it's something I won't soon forget, and I'll apply it in my own life. You're gonna enjoy this. Myles is an Australian who migrated, and you'll hear that in his accent in just a second. He's an Australian who migrated to the USA in 1989 and has since become a multimillionaire. He lives a free and unconstrained life, really doesn't have a job, so to speak, and yet he's never graduated high school, let alone went to college, but still incredibly successful and 100% self-made. He's a technologist, and he's made fortunes on Bitcoin since 2011, and he owns a portfolio of rental properties. Myles was one of a few survivors of a massive auto accident in the outback of Australia back in the 1990s, and that forced him to question his life, his purpose, and his direction. Since rebuilding himself from that, he knows how to handle and mitigate adversity and has honed those skills to live a life unconstrained. And we're going to talk about what that word unconstrained means to Myles. So without further ado, Myles, welcome to the ThriveMore podcast.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate being here.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. You have a very varied background, right? It's an incredibly varied background and not a normal path. And not that anything is normal really, but what people think, is a normal path. You've certainly gone about it in a different way. And if you could take us back to living in Australia and when that started and then how that kind of brought you to the USA, and we'll go through your story, but I think it's always important for the listeners and for me to get to know you and understand what makes you tick and how did this journey that you've been on, what was the impetus to start that?
Well, I come from a town on the south coast of Australia called Adelaide. I guess you call it a town. It's probably a city now. It's growing up in a place like that in the 60s when I grew up was idyllic. It wasn't anything like other parts of the world. Australia is a long way away from Northern America, Europe, and so on. So, it takes 15, 16-hour long plane trip to get anywhere. So people tend to be isolated, and living on a big island like that, you do tend to, even though it's a massive island with the land size, the size of the United States, it still feels like, it's a small town island kind of mentality. One of the things that, you only got 15 million people living down there. That's what it was when I was there. So everybody has to look after themselves and be very responsible. It's a country where anything on the ground will kill you if it wriggles around. So you kind of have to, you learn, it's funny, growing up very early in school, you get taught survival as part of your,
Wow.
reading, writing, math, history, and survival is part of your curriculum. So we're raised with the expectations that the buck stops on our desk and that it's up to us to learn how to get ourselves out of dangerous situations.
Yeah.
I'm sure we share a lot in common with countries like, say, South Africa, for example, or other nations which are more closer to nature and less urbanized.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how it was. So when I grew up, my parents were both concert pianists, which is a weird thing growing up as a classical musician. My mother put a violin under my chin at the age of 5 and said, by the time you're a teenager, you'll be in the symphony orchestra. And at the age of 11, I was in the junior symphony orchestra in my state. So she got her wish. But of course, when you're raised in that odd environment and in a very artistic family, your values are very different. They're not necessarily the expectation. Oh, one day kids are going to go to college and become a doctor or what. It wasn't like that. It was like what feels good, what serves your soul, what
Mm,
serves your purpose. There wasn't expectations on people back then to be something.
yeah.
You were happy. That was the success metaphor. If you were peaceful, you were happy, you'd made it. Even to this day, I kind of carry that on my shoulders, thinking that ultimately that's my responsibility, is to make me happy and to make my family, my daughter, and my friends happy. Sometimes that goes beyond reasonableness and you have to sort of pull back. But at the end of the day, I always grew up living in a world where I was always seeking a win-win scenario.
Yeah.
So fast forward, in my teenage years, I ended up moving from violin into things like electric guitar, and I started to learn the art of electronics. At the time, I think radio, like CB radio and ham radio and so on, was coming around. And I learnt that. And then I started getting good with a soldering iron. And the next thing you know, I understood there was this thing going on, this kind of dichotomy. And I've spoken to a lot of people over the years about this, but it's this kind of left brain battle. I
Mm,
had this very strong left right brain battle. I had this very strong right brain, which was my musical uh, career, and I was lucky enough to be blessed by parents that must have done something right musically, because I was
sure.
always pretty good at that. I skated through school on music; it was easy.
Mm,
On the left side of my brain was this sort of problem-solving pragmatist, this mathematical, logical kind of thinker. And I never felt until maybe I hit puberty that was ever exercised properly. So I ended up overdoing it in the world of technology. I
mm,
learned how to build computers with a soldering iron, not with software or
sure.
installing the latest Mac OS. No, we built it from the chips.
Yeah.
Um, when you're living in a country where you have to learn everything, you have to kind of be a jack of all trades. That was kind of where it started, and I ended up finding I was kind of blessed by being able to write software and build things. And so I ended up turning that into a business and convinced my father at the age of, I think, 15, before I was able to leave high school, that there was this thing coming around called the personal computer. And I wanted to I could see it as an opportunity. I wanted to be a part of this. And
Yeah.
somehow it was convincing enough. He let me do it. So
Wow.
I left before I finished high school and went and started a software company, and the rest is history. So
Wow.
by about the age of 25, the company had done very well. We had been writing software for defense contractors and government departments. And we did the weird thing is we wrote the cryogenic freezer storage system for the university that I never went to. they paid me to write their systems. That was the irony of it all. It was
Yeah.
like, results matter, and how you apply yourself in this world matters. And it doesn't matter your age, but it matters your passion and your commitment to getting the job done. And being raised in that world, I was able to. So it was
Yeah.
kind of my start.
I'm really glad that you shared that too, just around school and how you were still successful. I was raised, my parents, nobody in my family had ever gone to college, and I was the first one. And it was from a young age. You're going to college, and it was the first one to go to university and go to graduate school. And now I have grown children. One's 23 and one's 20. The 23-year-old did the 4-year stint at Chapel Hill, UNC, very traditional. Now she works for a large consumer packaged goods company, corporate route. My son, because it's funny, you and I, we didn't talk before because I don't do the pre-interviews, but I'm a musician as well. I'm a rock guitarist, and in my teens, my 20s, and later my 40s, revisited it. But he's a musician, and he at 18 drove to Los Angeles into Hollywood. He's like, I'm going to be an electronic music producer, and
Mhm.
he went to like a 1-year trade school around that. But 4-year college was just never. He finished high school early, kind of did some home study stuff to finish early, just because he hated it, wanted to get out. And I always tell people, like, I finished high school early. Oh, he must be super smart. Yeah, he's really smart, but honestly, he just wanted to get the hell out of there. It wasn't like he was working. He just wanted to get done.
Well,
But
I can relate to this story
yeah,
because, and this will relate to your
yeah.
son's situation. So at the age of 25, I went on a vacation with a friend of mine to Hawaii, and I met this girl and I fell in love, as you do. She lived in Los Angeles
Yeah.
and I lived in Adelaide. And so at one point, I ended up taking some time off work or my business, and I flew to LA and spent some time with her. And as it happened, we got married.
Wow.
So I found myself in Los Angeles unexpectedly, and then immediately entered the world of the immigration system in the United States, which is a total nightmare. And what that meant was that I had to petition for a change of status because I came into the country as a tourist and then I became engaged, and eventually we went to Vegas and got married. When you change status, the government is pretty slow to process your change of your immigration forms and so on. And it took probably about 9 months, I think, in total for them to actually get the job done. And during that time, you're not allowed to work. And you're also not allowed to leave because while this is an open matter, you can't leave. So I found myself in a foreign country with a girl that I just met that I got married in a world where I couldn't work. And all I had with me was a bag of clothes. No real money or anything like that. Maybe just enough to be able to survive a couple of weeks of vacation time. And that was about
Yeah.
it. And she had a job, thankfully, and an apartment. So we lived in that for a while. But what ended up happening was that I spent most of my days wandering around Ventura Boulevard in the valley trying to find where was I? What is this place? And I kept stumbling into Guitar Center, into the stores down there.
Yeah.
And one thing led to another. I ended up buying a guitar and an amp. And then because I couldn't work, I thought, well, what am I going to do? So I ended up answering some ads sitting up on the notice board in the Guitar Center, band members wanted. Joined a band, co-founded it with a friend of mine who actually was another immigrant. He came in from Ireland. And then that was what we did for like 6 to 9 months. And then we ended up becoming pretty good. And in the end, back in the late 80s, Hollywood was going through this transition from being a hair metal capital to alt rock, which was what we were doing. And we just rode that wave. And the next thing you know, we're sitting in front of every record label exec's desk and being taken out to lunch for record deals and all this sort of thing. And we're like, what happened? So long story short, eventually I did get my work permit, and then I got a day job, which ended up working in biotech of all things, which I didn't even know what that was. I was working as a software developer in this startup, but my passion was about music. So I ended up, the band did really well. We won the best unsigned band of LA in 1991, I think it was, 1990, 91. And then everything was going great. We were about to sign a record deal, and the bass player in our band she got scared. And in the end, she left. And that left us in a situation where the strengths of our band was vocal harmonies, and she was the only female in the band, and we couldn't find a female bass player to replace her that could sing like her.
Yeah.
So the band disbanded. And in the process, all of the relationships we built with producers and record labels and so on kind of sat there. So what I did was I took my technical skills and I said, well, what's on the other side of the glass in all these recording studios we found ourselves in? And I ended up finding that at this time in the world, the music industry was going through this transition from what they called analog, which is the old large format recording consoles, to digital. And here's a computer guy who's also a musician who was about to get signed in a band. So he knows his chops.
Yep.
But on the other side of the glass, there's all these buttons and lights flashing and, and I'm fascinated by this. So one of the guys who was our producer, a guy who was actually Tears for Fears producer, had come to me and said, I'll tell you what, I haven't got any real money to pay you, but if you teach me about computers and networking and digital technology, I'll match you hour for hour in these major, expensive, multi-million-dollar recording studios teaching you about how large format recording consoles work. I said, hell yeah.
Yeah.
So, because I got nothing to do now because my band split up, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I did. And next thing you know, it turned into a situation where I ended up building recording studios. And then at the end, I became a engineer at some of the major recording studios. At the time, we didn't know that they were going to be as prominent as they became, but I ended up being in situations where I was working in studios that were recording the Foo Fighters, Tool, massive bands,
Yeah.
and I'm sitting there at the recording console helping out where I can, and you know, passing on what I knew about how this stuff worked and what I thought about how that song could be better or whatever to people at the time that didn't really appear to be all that prominent, but then became
Sure.
prominent. That while I was also doing a day job. So I was working really hard. And then one day I got this phone call from Australia. It was about the mid 90s. And I had to go back because my mother had a car accident and I was the only person who could take care of her. So I dropped everything I was doing in the middle of this sort of massive ascendance inside of the Hollywood music industry. I went back to Australia. I ended up spending about 4 years there. That's when I had this car accident.
Mm.
I then had to recover from that. I had to pull myself back up by by my boots again, and injured and disabled and the whole bit. But I got back to it, and then eventually rebuilt my life. I got divorced, and it was a absolute dark side, real
Sure.
bad time. But
Sure.
the truth was that when I eventually did return back to LA, um, 4 years later, like 1999, 2000, something like that, the music industry had gone. Napster had
Yeah.
completely destroyed it. The record labels, the people I used to work with were either fired. A few of them that still stayed around would, I'd have lunch with them and they'd be like, yeah, well, we don't make records anymore. Or, yeah, now it's all,
Yeah.
iTunes and all this sort of stuff was happening. And I realized that I'd gotten remarried at the end of the
Mhm.
90s and I had a daughter, and I couldn't, in good faith, put them through this turmoil that is the music industry. Something which,
Yeah.
in the past I'd known and accepted on my own, but for them it's the bridge too far. It's not fair
Yeah.
on an 18-year old kid to have to be put in a city like Los Angeles with the expenses, and dad can't make enough money to feed the family. That's not going to cut it. So I
Yeah.
ended up just going back into software again, and I spent 20 years living in technology,
When,
really personally regretting not going back into the industry that was my passion,
yep.
but feeding the left side of my brain with software and all of that, and doing very well in that industry, but at the same time feeling like I was lying to myself.
Mm.
And it wasn't until, I guess, the last part of the 2010s that I ended up getting into a situation where financially I was completely independent. I didn't have to worry about money anymore. I mean, that's a lovely thing to brag about until you
Sure.
don't have it again. But but the truth is that in that world, I made the decision that I wanted to go back into music full time. The
Mm.
problem was, and I'd learned this by investing a lot in real estate in the 20 years prior, because my wife was really big on that. That was her thing, and she was, in retrospect, genius for doing that.
Yeah.
But we had amassed a very good portfolio of real estate properties and then realized that they were kind of like albatrosses around our necks. We didn't mind having them. We liked being landlords. We didn't regret that. And they were worth a lot more money than we paid for them. So we were very happy about it. But we couldn't travel. We couldn't leave because we always had to be there to look after something. And you can defer that to somebody else, but it's never going to be done the way you want it done.
Sure.
And remember, my wife's also Australian, so both of us were raised with this buck stops on your desk, you're responsible for everything. So we ultimately held all the responsibility for everything we did, including being landlords. And
Yeah.
we would want to try and maybe go to Italy for 3 months or 2 months or something. And, it's hard to manage rental properties when you do that. And eventually
Sure.
we realized that, is this going to be our future? We were in our 50s, going into our 60s, in my wife's case. But is this going to be our future? Do we want this? And we decided, we don't. We want freedom. We want to be unconstrained. We want to be able to travel, and we don't want society holding us back. And so we sold them all, and we sold
Wow.
everything. And then we bought this big property in central Mexico. And I had this stupid idea that I was going to build a recording studio there. And as it happened, it turned out that we're building the largest private recording studio in Latin America, from what I found out.
Oh, wow.
And I'm being surrounded by people who I looked up to in my earlier years, who are now helping me build this studio. And it's remarkable how this story turned about. I get my wish finally,
Yeah.
But what a way to get it. What a journey.
Because it never, I mean, Miles, it never happens the way we think it's going to happen. And
No.
that's, I believe, the beauty of life is the journey. That is the love. It's not the getting what you want, because usually when we get what we want, we realize, okay, we want something else now. Because I'm a huge music fan, of course, my son's involved in it. I don't get to talk music a lot on this podcast because it's business, health, and wealth. But I can't help myself. I want to go back. If we can just rewind the tape back to when you were in LA the first time,
Mm-hmm.
and you were in the recording studios, and I do recall that, where it was going from analog tape to digitally, and Cakewalk and Pro Tools were being used. So
Mm-hmm.
were you on that? And for the listeners, think old school recording studio where everything is being recorded to a tape, and it's got to be perfect. Like, if there's a harmony, it's got to be perfect. You can do it again and again and again until you get it right, but it's a human being creating that. And then it migrated to where, when it wasn't perfect, you could tweak it with the computer to make it perfect. And I think that's what Miles is referring to when that analog to digital conversion. As a musician, because I have my own thoughts around analog versus digital, and I'm old school, and I love putting music down on tape, right? And I like the imperfections, and I think, a guitar solo that sounds perfect to me is boring. A guitar solo that's got a little Jimmy Page in it, where you can tell there was one take or two takes, and there's a lot of it. You learn to love the imperfections. That's what makes it real and makes it so lasting forever, versus kind of bubblegum. What are your feelings? And you're building a studio right now. Like, you have to do digital because that's the world now. But where's your heart in recording music and the technologies?
Well, this is where the question of right brain and left brain comes together.
Mm-hmm.
So there's different hemispheres of thought, but my origins came from the right brain, so I can talk to that. I think that ultimately, so music's an expression of our humanity, and it is probably one of the ultimate expressions of that. It's one of the few, sound is one of the few sensory forms that we have that can give you goosebumps and touch your soul and make you cry. Yep. I mean, you can do the same with a movie, but it's hard with a silent movie to achieve that unless you actually put in dialogue and you put in the human.
It's usually the music that makes people cry too,
often,
by the way.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And when it comes to emotional reaction to that, that's not something that you can ever synthesize. You can support it with synthesis, but you can't support ultimately the expression of humanity. And when I look at music, I look at it from the point of view of telling a story, because I think stories resonate with people. They relate to stories. Mm-hmm. Music has to be authentic. The performer providing it, presenting it, has to be authentic. They have to be able to say, this is who I am. I'm going to open the kimono. I'm going to show you my soul. I'm going to tell you what I feel, what I think. I'm going to hope that it transfers to you and that it touches you in some way. That's what a musician wants to be, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if they're playing piano, guitar, drums. It doesn't matter if they're a DJ. It's got nothing to do with that. It's about telling stories and about transfer of emotional energy from party to party. Mm-hmm. None of what I've said then has anything to do with technology, anything to do with digital or analog. It's got nothing to do with that. It's all about the story. So it doesn't matter if you're listening to a Miles Davis recording from the 1950s. It'll make you cry. It doesn't matter if you're listening to Bob Dylan in the 60s with his horrible voice. His words will make you cry. That is why the Beatles are still held upon lofty heights as being the pinnacle of pop rock music, not because they were just, great. They were great players, great songwriters. They weren't great players, but they were good song crafters. But because somehow in their music, for the time and going forward, they told stories that resonated with people, and those people coagulated to those stories. If we forget that, we've got nothing. Art is not artificial intelligence. It might share the same first three letters, but it is not those things. And a computer that is trying to copy our humanity and copy our stories and copy our emotional reactions to things because it's cheap and easy and anybody with a computer can do it is not creating art. They're creating replica synthesis, like a plastic replica of a great statue. And at the end of the day, that's what we have to realize. And when it came to the business model of me looking at spending an enormous amount of money building this recording studio and then searching the world for literal vintage equipment to bring in, some of which there were only 3 or 4 examples of that left. My recording console was one of 4 I found in the world that was still standing.
Wow.
It's an old Neve, and I mean it's collectible.
Wow.
But the thing is that in order to do that and then to crate it and ship it all to Mexico, you have to have a mission. And for me, the mission was, it's about people. It's not about technology. We're organic. We're organic species. We've got skin. We don't have bits and bytes. That's not who we are. And it doesn't matter how I capture, whether I capture it on tape, whether I capture it in digital, what the bit rate is, it doesn't matter. What matters is the story and the material that matters. Musicians resonate to that. That's why they became musicians. They didn't become musicians to be great computer programmers. And trust me, I've been both. So
that's true.
It's about storytelling. It's about human emotion and art. And if we return ourselves back to that, we have a future as a species. If we forget that and we defer it and we say it's not important, we can just churn crap out and we don't care about telling the story. I pity our future, and I don't want that future. So I have to do what I have to do to try to promote not that.
Hey everyone, as you know, I don't have any advertisements nor sponsorships on this podcast. My only ask of you, the listener, is that you share this podcast with someone that you know, a friend, a family member, a coworker, or a colleague who may benefit from this information, may benefit from today's guest, from the value that they're sharing with the audience, with you, the listener. When you share this podcast and our audience grows, it allows me to book more and more guests who have a great message, great nuggets of wisdom that you can benefit from, and again, your network can benefit from. So please, right now, push that share button, send it to somebody that you care about, and let's get back to the interview. I agree with you that, I've heard AI generated music, and yes, it can be catchy and it can be, but to me, it feels vapid. There's just something that's not there. And because there's not the human emotion, that's at least not yet. So I would love to also, though, hear your thoughts, because when I'll hear a young band, they're called baby bands, a young band, when they're really starting to come up, and, I'll see them live or I'll hear a track, it's to me pretty obvious, like, holy moly, these guys are different. These gals are different. So when you were in the recording studio and you heard Dave Grohl, and he was the Foo Fighters before he hired the other musicians. He did the whole first album, or you heard Tool play, which is just they have some of the most intricate arrangements. Did you in that moment go, okay, guys, this is different, this is special, this is going somewhere? Or is it just, these guys are kind of cool, but who knows? I'm just kind of curious, like, what your emotional reaction was to hearing like 2 of those iconic bands really early in their career.
At the time, you didn't really notice it. I mean, this was in the early 90s, this was a time when everybody was seeking out creativity and invention, because LA's a weird place.
Yeah.
You go there when you're not from LA and you start realizing that the creativeness that you would have freedom to do in, say, I don't know, small town Ohio, that you can do, like Trent Reznor, great example, right? Guy from Pennsylvania, I think, Pittsburgh, created all of his best work when he had nothing to do with the music industry. I mean, and he himself will admit this, that it's like you fight against the toxic nature of a production city to be creative, because creativity and production are 2 very different things. One is a business and the other is art in its pure form. So if you can maintain the integrity of creativity and then somehow find some sort of a cohesion with production so that somebody can mass scale it and produce it, then you become Maynard and Tool, or you become Dave Grohl, or you become Reznor, or you become whoever. But when you're in the moment in the world of creativity, the production side of it and the success of that isn't yet apparent. What you see is, wow, these guys went there. That's pretty cool. Or I've never heard anybody be that loud, or I've never heard anybody be that angry, or that sad, or that gothic, or whatever it might be. It's like we all start from that, and then we try and expand it out to the extremes. And then one day somebody says, I'll write a check, for that. And then they produce CDs, and the next thing you've got these recordings. But you don't know at the time. You're living in the pure nature of creation, where business and success and the ability to scale it and all of that is not what you're thinking about. In fact, if you go in there thinking that, you're going to fail. That's just how it is. You've got to go in there with purity, and you've got to just hope that you're being honest and authentic, and that people get it. And if that's the case, then you'll be those people. I sat in the chair in the studio while they were going through those moments. And so I witnessed it, and I saw what they go through. But so many of my friends that I worked with this band called Sensefield. They were fantastic. I was so lucky to work with them. And I was working in the studio called Grandmaster Recorders, which is in Cahuenga in Hollywood. It's gone now. It's now a restaurant or luxury condos or something. But anyway, back in the day, it was quite famous. Stevie Wonder had recorded there. And actually, that's where the Foo Fighters did their second album. Cool did work there as well. Anyway, I was working with this band called Sensefield. They were the greatest guys, absolutely great guys. And I remember sitting behind the console with the guys from Capitol Records, the A&R guys behind, and sitting on the couch back there. And I'm just trying to ignore them because they're just annoying. I'm trying to record these guys, and there's this singer, and he is so passionate and so good. And what I heard was when he got up to the microphone, he was quiet and he just sang. Was just like this magical time. And the next thing you know, it's a hardcore post-punk band, right? The next thing you know, slam, and you're like, whoa, you're back like this. And all of a sudden it's like, there's the magic. He made you lean in. He made you, he entrapped you, and then bang, right? But that's how you get somebody's attention. And it's those emotional reactions. John, the singer, killed himself. And it was horrible because years later, after these guys were successful, they were on Letterman, they were very successful, but it stopped because the labels stopped making records. And then these guys who went from this creative beauty, innocent, organic thing got corrupted by a record label that told them that their success is how many units they sell and what's their bank balance and all these things. And when all of a sudden that was taken away, John couldn't handle it, and that was the end of him. And I've seen that story so many damn times. I think what I noticed as this kid from another country, raised in a world where, even though I was in business, I knew that ethics, morality, and purity in us as a species was above all else, and that business had to serve that, not the other way around. I came to a country which was the exact reverse. Everything was a transactional experience. Everything was about how much money I can make, how I can pay off my student loan debt, how I can afford to buy a home, how I can one day maybe I can retire. And people got trapped in this horrible whirlwind that was all about go in there and give be an actor on somebody else's screenplay, get a job, do what the boss tells you to do. Don't question anything. Shut up, just do the job. And 40 years later, maybe one day you'll walk out there with some 401k money and you'll be able to go into the Bahamas and whatever. It's an absolute crock. And what happens is that musicians know that. They know that it's not their authentic self. They know it is not life. It is not our mission. We were not born as babies to be put in that treadmill. That is
Yeah.
not who we are. But the problem is you can't fight it, right? You've still got to pay your rent. You've still got to pay your mortgage. And if it means that you've got to wait tables to get to where you have to be, you've got to do what you got to do. I get it.
Yeah.
Artists suffer for their mission, but they're authentic and they're pure and they know they have to stay that way. And the second they corrupt that and they sell out, that's it. And then we
Yeah.
get what we get. And that's why
Yeah.
music's been dead for such a long time, because our economy won't allow it anymore. You know, for anybody out there, I know your show is about business and entrepreneurialism, and I might sound like some freaking hippie liberal, which I'm not. But honestly, if you are not true to yourself and you don't know your mission, then you are wasting your time. When a kid's 18 and they don't know their mission, I have a daughter too. She's 27.
Yeah.
When she was that age, I made the stupid mistake of putting her in college, thinking that that's when in Rome, right? You do as everybody else. I paid for her so she didn't have any debt, thank God. But at the end of the day, I put her in that machine and I watched it, and I'm like, what a mistake. But once you start, what do? Right?
Yeah.
And to her, it was fine because everybody else thought it was okay. But I looked at it and I'm like, the best education she should have had would be for me to give her a round trip airline ticket and a passport and maybe $20,000 and go see the world, go wait tables in Tokyo, go live in a hostel in London, go meet people from India and Germany, go climb Everest. I don't know. Do what you've got to do. Find yourself. Once you've found that, you've met adversity, you know how to survive in a country that doesn't speak your language, you'll have that confidence in yourself to be able to seek out true purpose. And if you do that, that's your best education. And you won't be carrying around 100 grand with a student loan debt you can't pay off.
Yeah.
And that to me would have been the education in retrospect.
Yeah, that's gold what you just shared, and I'm aligned with that. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have felt differently, but not in today's world. I think it is a treadmill. Kids are coming out of school with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that is going to take them forever to pay off if they do, and they're getting degrees and stuff that really don't have a real application because they don't know what they want to do. And then they're thrown in the world and realize, okay, this is a lot harder than they told us it was going to be. You know, they don't prepare them in our academic world for real life, so to speak. So I've really changed my tune the last 10 years on formal
let me add
education.
to that. When I was 22, my father died. He worked for a company for 40 years. He was your traditional company man, you know. And all through that period of time, he did what the company told him to do, and he was honest and, you know, ethical, and he raised me. And I appreciated him. But when I got that call that he had had a heart attack and died, I had to be the person to pick up the pieces and look after my mom and all of that stuff. I mean, it was just, and for a 22-year-old, that's a lot on your shoulder.
Sure.
But after I went through all of the traditional ceremony of death, you know, it's just like, you know, funerals and all that. But after all of that, I spent a lot of time with my mom, and I had to go through all of his financial affairs. And I was, you know, I had business acumen. I was good at that. Yeah. So it wasn't a problem. I could help with that. But I remember going through his chest of drawers and finding all the papers and, you know, trying to put together, like, did he have any money and where was it and how's my mum going to be able to survive, pay the bills? Well, we found it all. It was there. But I look back at the age of 67, he died. He retired at 65. I thought, my God, this was his golden age, right? This was his time to go and have travel the world and, you know, but he had it taken from him. And then I looked at the whole history of it. As it happened, he worked for a company that made roofing material in Australia. They were a big corporation. And I'm not going to mention who they are, but their biggest product, the most successful product they made was asbestos roofing tiles.
Oof.
And my father spent a career living in the world of blue asbestos, which killed him. And in the end, we didn't know at the time that this was mesothelioma or any of those sort of things that now, becomes the popular topic on class action lawsuits for lawyers.
Sure.
But we didn't know that back then. I just knew my dad died. And I looked at the whole thing and I tried to piece together what somebody who gives away their whole purpose and their soul to a company and how he got treated, because ultimately the company sort of took his life, right?
Yeah.
And with that took my father and my mother's husband. And, the whole thing is just a disaster. And it's a human story that gets taught to us in society and metrics and statistics, and this percentage of people at this age can afford to retire. It's like you don't see the human story, right?
Yeah.
Think of it like a musician would think of it, and there's a human story here. There's a song, there's a poem, there's a thing to touch you, because then when you get it, you go, there but for the grace of God go I.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what I did. I said, I am not going down that path. I am not going to take that job. I am not going to get suckered into that system, because this is what happens at the end of it. And the more that I was seeing when I came to the United States, I was seeing people lied to. I was seeing people who drank the Kool-Aid and every other colloquial statement that we can use to recognize that. But I just saw it over and over, repeating over and over. And I saw my father and him lying on that gurney, on that stretcher in the hospital when I had to go down and ID the body. And I saw that and I'm like, this is wrong. This is wrong. And yet it's so hard to resist, because society, our social mantra, our culture, parents who don't know any better are telling their kid, sign that debt contract to get a student loan and go and study whatever, and you'll be able to enter the middle class. I didn't finish high school. I did it right.
Yeah.
I did the polar opposite of everybody else. And nobody tells my story. Nobody tells what life is like when you don't do that. It's not the same world. We are so conditioned with stories of fear. I live in central Mexico. I'm talking every day, even this morning, I'm talking to a guy from Canada who's like, oh, what'd you go down there? You're going to get beheaded by the cartels. It's like, do you know that the death rate in the city I'm at is so low, and it's about 20 times more in St. Louis right now, or Chicago, or LA? And you think I'm unsafe? I mean, this is insane. And yet this is our narrative. We are lied to so many times by society, our media, our politicians, our government. But rather than turning that into some conspiracy theory, I do it I fight it by way of action. I say, well, if everybody is getting a shitty ride at the end of the day of doing this, don't do it, right?
Don't do it.
Ultimately, responsibility is on our shoulders. Buck stops on our desk. I was raised, you respect nature and you respect the snake on the ground because it's going to kill you. That's where it is. It's up close and personal. It's on us. And the other part of this that's so important, I think, is that if we put ourselves forward first, there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be a patriot. You don't have to serve the military. You don't have to do that. Maybe that's what your parents did in the World War II generation or whatever. When we're in so much crisis all the time, I get it. We all have to band together and fix things. But that doesn't mean that you sell yourself out for it. And at some point, despite all of the doom and gloom on the press of wars here and the economy's going to hell and we've got too much debt and all of that, yeah, we do. And I get that. And those are fixable problems. But you don't sell yourself out in the process. You don't let it corrupt your own personal mission. And our goal, if I was to tell any kid these days what to do, is find your mission, right? Don't let your parents tell you what it is. Don't let your government or your politicians or your teachers or your school guidance counselor tell you what it is. They don't know. And trust me, when you are down on your luck and you need somebody to help you, that school guidance counselor is not the person you're going to call, right? You got to look at yourself. You got to dig deep. You got to find that sense of spirit and purpose, who you are, and then you've got to be true to it. And the more we are true to ourselves, the more we will be a stronger species. It's not just a country, it's a species.
Yeah. No, pure gold. I would love, I have a few questions to ask you at the end, but I would love if you could just briefly talk to, because you're building this what's going to be the largest recording studio in Central America, and a heck of an investment. But the way I understand the music business now is that artists really are recording music just to allow them to go out on the road. That the touring is where all the money is, the merch is where all the money is. That really recording an album, releasing an album, it's almost a loss leader, just so you can get new music out there, so that you can generate the crowds at the venues.
Mm-hmm.
Is that really what you're seeing, and is that the kind of the playbook for a lot of musicians these days?
Yeah, but it's not actually bad. What I mean by that is that if you go back to 100 years or so before the age of the phonograph record, the recorded media, how did musicians survive? Well, they played gigs. They toured. If you go back to medieval times, the bard toured the village and played, and then went to the next pub, and then went to the next pub. This is how it's always been. It's only in the last 100 years that we actually had the recorded media. And the idea was that musicians felt they could, and I don't want to use this term, get lazy, it's not the right word, but they could rely on some sort of a proxy in their part, or a CD or an LP record or a Spotify stream, to be able to survive. And the truth is that that was never the case 100 years ago. And we're just going back to what it was back then. And it's okay to perform and play music, because you're putting yourself out there in public and you're saying, okay, here's what I got. And then you're going to see whether or not people resonate with it. And you can see in the eyes of the crowd if they are reacting positively to what you're doing or not. You can't see that on a Spotify playlist, right? You don't have no idea. And you might say, well, it's got X number of streams or whatever, but does that matter? Is it, you don't see if you're touching somebody, you don't see any of that. And for musicians to get back into that in-person experience, yeah, it is true. Look, there are bands out there that will complain they're on the road 300 nights a year and living in shitty vans and couch surfing just to get through the moment, whatever. But that's not why. That's maybe that's the downside of being a musician. But if you ask them, would you do it any differently? They'll say no.
No,
I love it out there with the crowd. I love it out there on stage. I love it with my band members. I love writing. I love working in the studio. I love it all. I wouldn't change a thing, but it'd be nice to get paid, know.
Sure.
But it's not about it's not the transactional experience all the time. And if you want to do something to get paid, don't be a musician. Go work on Wall Street.
Yeah.
Right. And then see if you're happy.
So I ask every guest like the same three questions at the end, because it's always interesting, because they're always different. So is there a book? I'm a huge avid reader. The listeners know that. Is there a book that and it can be nonfiction, fiction, whatever, that really impacted you in a way, either in your youth or maybe last week, that you read that book and you set it down and you said, wow, I will never think about this topic or this situation the same based on what I just absorbed from that author? Is there one that you could recommend to the listeners?
Yeah, there is. Well, there's a lot of books. I find that ultimately the best knowledge of life experiences are gained in fiction, not nonfiction. I mean, if you put something in nonfiction that you can relate to, it's this is what happened kind of story. That's not necessarily what drives the future. I mean, there is one would argue that history can predict the future to some degree if we want to live like we used to. Ultimately, what predicts the future in my mind is nonfiction. It's the hopes and dreams and the stories that come with that. There's a guy I met from Chicago, very unknown, and his name's Paul Rosenberg. And he wrote a book which touched me probably more than any other book has touched me, called The Breaking Dawn.
The Breaking Dawn.
And it's a story, it's a fictional story about what happens when society gets taken over by, I guess you call it almost like totalitarian surveillance, and kind of the sort of thing that you would ask most people in, say, China, that they're dealing with on a daily basis. But when you add a certain futuristic power to that, the power of big data and AI and so on. And I know there's a bazillion books like this out there, but the way he tells this in this, it's not a small book, it's not a small read, but it is a beautiful story about how people escaped that world and why they escaped that world, and the thoughts of an artist, the thoughts of a philosopher, the thoughts of somebody who's trying to exist in this urban concrete world that is surveilling them every 5 minutes. And when I read that book, I'm like, holy crap, that is so real. And I know
Yeah.
it's not George Orwell in 1984, which, that alone was supposed to be a warning, and it became the standard operating procedure nowadays.
Yeah, the playbook. Yeah.
But I just feel like if we as a species want to escape our own tyranny, it comes from the fiction artist, the writer who tells the story as a warning, or maybe as a just don't do this, or this is how you could get out of it, or this is, those things touch me the most. And
Yeah.
I'm 59 right now, so I'm looking at the last quarter of my life, and I look at the future. It's easy. It's funny. I was thinking about this the other day. It's easy to think about it when you hit certain thresholds at certain points in your life. You look differently at certain things. And in the past, when you're in your second quarter, like you're 25 to 50 years, you're building, right? You're building a career and identity and a house and a family and all that stuff. You get past that, and then you're consolidating and you're trying to optimize because you're trying to suck away money for the future because God forbid you get old and you're going to need it. And then you hit that last quarter, and most people get really, really conservative. They don't want to spend any money. They want to live like a squirrel on their nut harvest of the past, and that's how they are. But I'm very atypical in this. I am such a futurist at this point, and I'm so interested in what will come when I'm gone, that everything that I'm trying to do right now is to invest in something that will live on beyond me.
Mm.
Our recording studio is built with solid poured concrete walls. I am Cemex's biggest customer here in Mexico. I have cement like crazy here, but that building will last 500 years.
Yeah.
And the town just down the street where I am, I'm in San Miguel de Allende here in the center of Mexico. It's a Spanish colonial town that was built in the 1500s. Those buildings still stand,
Yeah.
right? And they still look as beautiful as they did when they were built. And that's the important thing. If I have to leave anything behind, it's going to be that I didn't put together crap that was going to last, 5 years of entropy.
Yep.
That I'm building something of substance which will last the future, and that I can pass to somebody, pass the baton to the next person to carry that forward. I'm just one of a long line of people here carrying a torch, and somebody will come after me.
So that's a great segue into the second to last question, which I always ask this is, if we fast forward and you've finished this last quarter of your life, and I'm sure it'll be a beautiful last quarter, but at some point for all of us, it comes to an end. And if we were to fast forward to your funeral and you're looking down from above or from wherever, and there's a loved one reading your eulogy, and Myles, they're only allowed to choose 3 words, 3 descriptors to describe how you impacted them, how you impacted the people that are probably at your service. And they can only choose 3 words to say what they feel about you, or, describe you. What 3 words do you hope that person says?
Okay. Honest, passionate,
Mhm.
and a surfer. And the last one's important. I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
I never finished high school, right? But it didn't hurt me. I'll tell you what I learned, the biggest lesson I learned in life. When you're a kid in Australia, you're raised by the ocean, and all your mates, when you're a teenager, you all want to become great surfers. That's kind of in our DNA. And I did too. So we all got our surfboards. We were going to, a paper route and saved our money up and bought surfboards. And a buddy of mine had one of those VW microbuses. So we'd all head out into the middle of the country and go surfing. And so you don't know what you're doing, right? You see all these guys out there having a whale of a time, and it seemed like, I want to be like that guy riding that wave, right? So you go out there and immediately you go, oh God, what have I got myself into? It's hard work. It's dangerous. There's sharks, and you think you're going to catch a wave only to find the surfboard get smashed back and hits you in the head, and it's just horrible. And day after day after day, you're out there trying to become the surfer, and you're just not able to do it. And then one day, after a number of days of doing this, and you're questioning, what the hell did you sign up for? You start to get it. And that's when the universe tells you something. And this is important. You don't ever catch a wave when it's already upon you. You don't catch a wave when it's gone past you. You catch a wave when you put yourself in front of it, position yourself, point at the shore, and paddle like crazy. And the second that you become a moving target, that wave sees you, and it doesn't see you as an adversary. And it picks you up. And all of the power of the universe that it has transfers it to you, and you get the ride of your life. And the second I could see this and I could see patterns, I realized that in life, if you ever want to be successful, you've got to be the surfer who's in front of the wave, paddling like crazy, and you get picked up by it. I recognize this because in the world of technology, if you ever want to become successful, you have to, as the Canadians will say, was it put the puck go where the puck is going or something?
Skate where the puck is going. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. And it's exactly that. You've got to be ahead of it. I made my money when I recognized that stock markets were like the ocean and waves. You have to be ahead of it.
Yep.
Crypto was like the ocean and waves. Real estate was like the ocean and waves. Everything is like the ocean and waves. The universe has given us this knowledge. We just choose not to see it. What happens is nobody teaches this crap in college or high school. And what ends up happening is that the richest people are the ones that went out and bought the dog nobody wanted. That is, they positioned themselves ahead of the wave when the water was low and started paddling only for the wave to pick them up. You'll never, ever be successful listening to some influencer or following some guy who tells you buy gold when gold is $2,300 an ounce. I was telling people buy gold when it was $1,100. I told people buy crypto when it was $7 a Bitcoin. That's when I bought it. Nobody wanted to hear that. I was the surfer. I was in front of the wave, looking behind me going, there's a wave coming. Everyone was like, what are you talking about? Get out of the water. No. This is it. You have to understand how to read the waves. And the only way you're going to do that is to go out into the world and understand how the universe works and understand the trends and what makes people happy, what makes people sad. These are the things that teach us something. And so if anybody was to sum me up, as much as I'm not very good at it, I was the surfer. And that's the key.
I love that. And I don't know if there's a better final ending than what you just shared, because that analogy is beautiful. It's almost poetic. So the last question I'm just going to ask you then is, how can people follow you, Myles? How can they, connect with you, be part of your journey? Like I find you to be part philosopher, part futurist, part technologist, part musician. So you have that artist with you, like artist and commerce meeting. And I just know that other people would love to be part of that. How do they connect with you? How do they be part of your journey?
Well, I started to try to chronicle a lot of this stuff about 5 years ago on a website called beunconstrained.com.
Okay.
And I wrote articles, and I started a podcast, which is called the Unconstrained Podcast, and people can listen to it there. But I just encourage them to go to that website and just dig around a bit. They'll find the stuff I talk about. It's very hard to, you'll know this as a podcaster, but it's very hard to say in 60 minutes or in 5 minutes the important things that need a lot more digging deeper.
Yep.
But I think I've learned over the years that you plant a seed and then other people have to water it and tend to it, because all you can do is just say, hey, I'm not telling you exactly what to do, but you might want to consider, and then just leave it there. And that's kind of, I think I've gotten to the point in life where that becomes the way of doing it. But beunconstrained.com is a good place to start.
We'll actually put that in the show notes so that people can just click right there as they're listening to the show to take them. Well, wonderful. Myles, this has been just a great experience for me. We went down a completely different path than I thought we were going to go, but a better one, and just a more enjoyable one, and a richer discussion. So thank you so much for just, graciously just opening up and sharing your thoughts and your journey because that's going to help people. Anybody that listens to this is going to be better off for having heard you. So thank you so much for your contribution.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. That's very, very kind.
You bet. Thank you for tuning in to the ThriveMore podcast. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes for any of the resources that we mentioned during the podcast. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you have access to the latest and the greatest. You can connect with me on any of the socials at Real Roger Martin. And be sure to check out our website, ThriveMoreBrands.com. There you'll find information on the brands we support and information on franchising. Thanks again for tuning in.